In the last section, we introduced the idea of an embedded collection of posts inside of our user model. The one thing that I want to make sure is really clear is that we are going to have a post schema, but not a post model. So we're not going to make a Mongoose model out of posts. We're only going to make a schema. The reason for this is that we only create Mongoose models to correspond to a collection of records inside of our database. Because these posts are not represented by a standalone collection, we're not going to make a post model. We will only make a post schema. All right, so let's get started and we'll start by creating our post schema first, which should only have a title that's going to be a string. Once we create that schema, we'll wire it up to our user schema. So the user schema is going to be aware that it should have a kind of sub-collection or embedded list of posts inside of it. One last thing I want to say before we get started with any code, in the Mongoose world, this idea of kind of embedding one resource inside of another is referred to as sub-documents. So our user model itself is what we refer to as a document. The post that we're going to embed inside of it is referred to as a sub-document. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to flip over to my code editor, and the first thing we're going to do is create a new file to just house or hold the post schema. So inside of my source directory, I'll make a new file called post.js. Now the one thing I want to say here is that it's a little bit misleading creating a completely separate file to house the post schema by itself, just because all these files that we have in the source directory right now, you might think to yourself, well, these are models, surely both of these things are models. It could be worthwhile to rename this thing to like post schema, just to differentiate between a file that only holds a schema versus a file that holds both a schema and an actual model declaration. So just something I want to throw out there. The naming convention that we have here maybe could use a little bit of work. So inside of our post file, we will create a new schema and then export it and then make use of it inside of our user.js file. So we'll start by importing Mongoose. And then off of this Mongoose, and I keep on misspelling it, Moongoose. All right, there we go, Mongoose. We will pull off one property off the schema, or excuse me, off of the Mongoose object, which is our schema. So there's our schema right there. So now we can use this object to create our post schema. So we'll say const post schema is new schema. As we mentioned several times now, a post is only going to have a single property, and that is its title. So we'll give it a title of string. Now remember that we are kind of under the understanding here that these posts are supposed to represent blog posts. I'm only giving it a title right here, but you could just as easily add on some other stuff like, maybe content, and that could be a string. Or you could add on like a created at to represent when it was actually created, all that kind of good stuff. Just for the purposes of this example, we'll keep the schema of this thing or the different properties it has nice and simple, but certainly we could add on some additional schema or additional properties later on in the future. Then after creating the post schema, we'll add on our export statement. So module.exports will be post schema. Okay, so we created the schema now. We did not create a Mongoose model because this is not going to map to a distinct collection of posts inside of our Mongo database. We're now going to flip over to our user model file. So here's user.js, and we need to wire this thing up to we need to wire up our post schema to this user model, this user schema. So first at the top, we will import our post schema. So I'll say const post schema, and I'll require that from in the same directory. So I'm going to do a / find the post file. So now here's the fun part. We need to somehow communicate to the user schema that it should have an embedded list of posts, which are represented by the post schema. To do so, we will add a new property to our user schema, inside of which we will say, hey, user schema, you should have a property of posts, and it should contain an array or a list of post schemas. So I'll say post schema like so. So now Mongoose is going to look at this property. It's going to notice that it's an array, So it knows that this should be a list of records, and then it will see that there's a schema here, and Mongoose is just going to infer, it's just going to kind of make the big assumption that, okay, this must be a nested subdocument or list of subdocuments of some kind. So that's all we really have to do to wire up this association. Now, whenever we create a user, we have the option to add a post property, and inside of there we can have an array of posts. Right now we don't really have any validation or anything around that, but we certainly could add some in as well. So let's take a quick break, come back in the next section and write some tests and just kind of figure out exactly how these embedded documents work.